Hi, this is Andy from HowEFIWorks.com, and today I want to talk about basic race car power relay panels. We have a few basic goals for any relay panel that we might be using. You always want to buy or build one designed for a standalone EFI. A primary concern is you need to be able to understand it and troubleshoot it. You can't take these cars back to a dealer anywhere and have them take care of you. The next thing is you can independently kill any one circuit as required for testing and troubleshooting. You need a reliable. Waterproof sure helps when you have off-road vehicles, Jeeps, rock crawlers, that sort of build. I want to supply power to the wideband and fuel pumps and usually to the injectors and coils only when the motor is cranking or running. That comes in handy when you leave the ignition switch on to do some programming, and you don't want to burn those up, especially the widebands. And never try to utilize or save the stock power panel. It's just not worth it. Life is too short to save that $200 bill. This is a basic relay. These things have been around for years. They sit about 1-inch cube underneath the dash on most production vehicles, on many production vehicles. The way these things work is on the left side, all we have is an electromagnet or a coil, and you feed it 12 volts in ground. It takes very little real amperage to fire these things. And it really doesn't matter if you feed power or ground to 85 or 86, they'll work either direction. But when you do feed power to it, what it does is pulls this switch over to the other side where 30 and 87 are connected. When you let the power go off this thing, what happens is the power then goes from 30 to 87, or possibly ground goes from 30 to 87. It depends what you're trying to do with it. Anytime you look at a wiring schematic, like a factory wiring schematic, these things are always drawn in the what's known as the normal position, which is what the coil will command on the switch when there is no power applied. So now let's look at a basic wiring diagram of how you need to wire these things up. On the left at the bottom is your battery. Power goes through a master kill switch. It's a pair of switches that run in unison. When you pull this thing up or flip it to the side, both sets of contacts open up. So let's make the assumption that we're feeding power both directions through it. That power then feeds to a bus bar within the power relay. Some of the power then goes back to the what's known as the master relay. Any time the master relay is de-energized, you want the entire system to die. If the master relay is on, what happens is the power, if you follow the red lines, here's where the power goes through. The first thing that comes up is the power is fed to the ECU through a small fuse. This is about a 1, 2, maybe 3 amp fuse. They're pretty small typically. Once you feed power to the ECU, it then gives a signal back to the fuel pumps as in a ground. Notice the arrow pointing to the left. The power will go into each one of these coils and then return back to the ECU, catching ground at the ECU. It's important to know that the ECUs typically only give ground or no ground at all. They do not feed power out to these. Next, we want to think about the right side of this sketch. The commanded ground coming from the ECU brings down all three of these relays. After 2 seconds, if the motor is not cranking, and sometimes that's adjustable on the ECU, but after a couple of seconds, it will drop the ground and all these will go dead. Once you're cranking again, all three of these get ground through 3 separate switches to bring down power to the injectors, power to the ignition coils, and power to the fuel pump and wideband. The reason I have these 3 switches in here is so that I could isolate any one system if I needed to for troubleshooting purposes. At the bottom is the fan relay. Again, it gets its signal or ground from the ECU, And once the ECU says that it needs cooling, this relay comes down and feeds power to the fans. One thing I'd like to point out is should you do PWM speed control on the fans, this relay would need to be a solid state relay and cannot be a simple set of contacts. Now, if we think through, the top bluish green wire is grounded when the engine is running only. The power to the ECU has actually got 12 volts power when both power switches, the master and the ignition switch, are in the on position, and you have a ground when the master kill switch is on. If you want to add extra relays to your system, you could add them between this ground and this power, or this ground and this power, depending on if you want that system hot when the engine is running, or do you want it hot all the time. Think, for example, windshield wipers or headlights, taillights on an off-road car of some sort, maybe a rock climber that has lights. You don't want those lights on if the motor's not running, probably. So you may not have ever thought about what happens when you get in an accident and you can't personally get to the ignition switch. Maybe you're hurt. And the safety crew gets to you and hits the master kill switch, and you do not break this wire. Well, there's a pretty good chance your cooling fans might be on. Those cooling fans, or maybe alternator, can actually produce voltage as they spin down. That voltage then goes down through 87, through 30, and backfeeds the entire system. And just because you have that switch killed, the power is still enough coming from that fan to keep this relay down if you don't break that wire. And sure enough, you can follow all the arrows and nothing dies until that fan dies. Keep in mind you get exactly the same effect from an alternator. In the case of an alternator, if in fact that shows up, is the car may never die. So now let's think through the sequence of events when someone pulls the master kill switch. The first thing that happens when you pull open the master kill switch is this line feeding all these relays dies. When that happens, the master relay dies and the power no longer gets to the ECU, so the ECU will no longer feed ground to the fans or the fuel pump. The next thing that happens a few microseconds later is all 3 or 4 relays will drop out because they no longer are getting power or ground from anywhere. Notice that the only place this entire system gets ground is through the master kill switch. Here's a power panel I found out on the internet. These things go for about $200, and I'll show you the source of them later. But they can be built in almost any configuration with any size amperage you need. You could add extra fuses to this thing. It's kind of nice. There's a rubber seal. There's a top that pops down on this, and it ends up with all the wires just coming out the back or side. Here's what it looks like from the back. Everything is all sealed up just in case you manage to get your car underwater or whatever. And you can see that all the wires are sealed up. There's also tabs on here that have the body panel nuts that you can pop in from the side or the back. Here it is from the side. You can see where that clip comes in from the side. So you can have it hanging up underneath a panel or possibly through a panel by mounting on these 2 bolts and cutting a squarish hole. This thing's about the size of a dollar bill. If you go to our original wiring diagram, that seems a little overwhelming. But when you do lay this out on a table, it's not so bad. We have a red wire with a white tracer that is power to the ECU. We have a yellow wire and blue with yellow tracer. That's basically the pattern through this. Then you could run for the ejectors, green wire and the blue with green tracer running to the fuel pump, cooling fans, ignition, so on and so forth. And the main power line, which is a big wire, also is in the master kill switch. That's where you would wire that in. So it's not so bad once you lay the thing out. All these parts and pieces are available from a company called Kinetic Creations. If you go around their website, you won't find this particular part, but this guy, Jacob, can build almost anything, and he's going to be putting these into production. If you don't see some of the stuff on his website, just contact Jacob and he'll be able to help you out. Here are some of the parts and pieces. Most of these did come from Jake. This is the panel before it has anything put in it. These are the standard relays. These are a micro relay that are readily available. There's a couple of different sizes for a number of holes. He also has pieces that you can run power through panels that are awful nice. Up at the top right is a solid state relay you can wire into a system if you're going to be controlling things like fans. I want to warn you that sometimes you run into amperage issues. I think this one is rated for 30 amps, but there's all kinds of solid state relays out there. On the right side, what I have is a small voltage regulator, which you use as far as if you have some delicate electronics in the car that possibly you have an 18-volt system or a 16-volt system that charges at 18 volts, but you don't want to send 18 volts to your tachometer, your wideband, that sort of thing. These things are rated at like 3 amps, 4 amps. There's a screw on the back that you can use to adjust them down to whatever voltage you want. That particular piece I found out on Amazon. They're relatively available. Jake has all the little crimp-ons, the plugs, that sort of stuff. The fuses are standard mini fuses that you can get at the auto parts store, very common in General Motors cars. You can also get them, I believe Jake can get them, is relays with LEDs in them, which is very handy if you have a blown system somewhere in the dark in the heat of battle at the racetrack. It makes it far easier to troubleshoot what system has gone down on you. And then you may or may not have seen these. These are little relays that you can buy. You can get them where they're 12-volt relays or they're 5-volt relays. So you can use them to power things like shift lights, buzzers, whatever you might need, like a check engine light. Whatever you need to control, these things can be purchased extremely cheap, like in the $10 range. It's been a while since I bought it, but it shocked me how cheap it was. This is an example of an all-metal kill switch. This thing's about 2 inches across. Here's your main terminals for the main power going through, and this is where the ground wire breaks. This particular one comes with a couple of rubber shields for these big high-power lugs, and this one comes from Jags for about $40. I've seen them sold through other names from other websites, but they're all about the same price. If you want to up the ante a little bit, this comes from a company called Autorod.net. I've seen these on several race cars lately. What they are lighted panels. If you blow a fuse, I believe it lights up red if you blow a fuse. And you've got all the relays, but you still need to wire them for the same basic logic that I had in my schematics if you decide to go this route. Here's another route you can go if you want to up the ante again. This one comes from ECU Masters. It's called a PMU16. This happens to be the data logger version. They go for about $15.50, and what they have the capability of doing is data logging the amperage in any single circuit in this thing. It's all fully programmable. It can be connected to CAN. You can turn off headlights, wipers, whatever you want to do through the CAN network or through switches. They're really cool. I have not personally wired one of these. I've seen plenty of cars that had them, but they really clean up the entire car if you want to go that route. But again, it is quite a bit more expensive. Motec also makes a very similar unit. I want to thank my friends at tunerstudio.com. These are the developers of Mega Log Viewer HD, the software I use to tune most of these cars. And should you feel the desire to help me stay motivated, you can always go to paypal.me/howefi works. Thanks for watching.